Christian Horner's revenge on Red Bull has just been exposed after shocking new talks with Ferrari. If you want to know exactly what was discussed and how it could turn the entire paddock upside down, stay with us until the very end. This video is made for you. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. After 20 intense and tumultuous years defined by tactical excellence, ruthless competitiveness, and an unyielding grip on team control, Christian Horner's long-standing rule over Red Bull racing has come to an abrupt and shocking conclusion, one that has rattled the foundations of the Formula One universe and stunned even those closest to the epicenter. For 2 full decades, Horner wasn't merely a leader. He was the architect, the commander, the singular force who molded Red Bull into a modern-day racing powerhouse. He masterminded victories, navigated the murkiest political waters, and became a fixture not just in the garage but in the boardrooms where the future of the sport is carved out. His departure doesn't just mark the end of a leadership cycle, it detonates the very structure he built. No one saw it coming. Not with this velocity. Not with this finality. The announcement arrived like a punch to the chest, brief, sterile, devoid of gratitude, cold to the point of cruelty. There is no grand farewell, no celebration of legacy, no ceremonial send-off befitting a man who had transformed a drink brand's marketing experiment into one of the most feared, efficient, and technologically superior teams in the history of motorsport. And yet, when the statement was delivered bland and mechanical, it confirmed what many behind the scenes had begun to sense, that something far more poisonous had been festering beneath the surface, a battle of influence and ideology that had finally spiraled out of control. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. In recent seasons, cracks had begun to form, barely perceptible at first, then impossible to ignore. The smooth machinery of the team began to grind under the weight of competing ambitions, behind-the-scenes maneuvering, and an increasingly volatile environment. Tensions rose between Horner and those aligned with Max Verstappen's inner circle, a powerful axis that included the ever-influential Helmut Marko and, even more explosively, Max's father, Jos Verstappen. Jos had never hidden his disdain when decisions didn't favor his son's trajectory. But over time, his private frustrations escalated into open defiance. He challenged Horner's authority, questioned his motives, and perhaps most damaging of all, began lobbying internally against him. It was no longer just about racing strategies or aerodynamic tweaks. The battle lines had shifted to something deeper, more toxic, a fight over loyalty, identity, and who truly held the soul of Red Bull racing. Jos, always blunt, began accusing Horner of weaponizing his public image, alleging that the team principal had become more interested in maintaining his celebrity, leveraging his proximity to power, and strengthening his external connections than ensuring the long-term health of the squad. Those accusations gained traction as other senior voices began to whisper doubts, fueling a quiet mutiny that Horner couldn't control. As internal divisions widened, once neutral departments began choosing sides. Engineers noticed changes in the chain of command. Certain voices began carrying more weight than others. Technical directions that once passed through Horner's desk were now debated in closed-door meetings where he was no longer invited. The Verstappen-Marko block grew increasingly organized, coordinating communication, influencing junior staff, and building a parallel power structure within the very heart of the team. What had once been an unshakable command center began to feel like contested territory. Each week brought more uncertainty. Subtle power plays unfolded during race weekends, changes in strategy made without Horner's final say, internal leaks that undermined his press briefings, and growing signs that drivers and engineers were operating with their own agendas. Disagreements were no longer solved through debate. They were managed through silence, avoidance, or brute force. Horner found himself surrounded by people he no longer trusted, in meetings that felt like traps, answering questions that had hidden implications. The political game he had once mastered was now consuming him. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. By the time the formal decision came down, Horner's support base had all but collapsed. He stood isolated, no longer protected by the loyalty he once commanded effortlessly. The board, facing mounting pressure, fractured allegiances, and whispers of long-term instability, acted swiftly. There was no vote of confidence, no opportunity for redemption. Just a final, irreversible decision. Christian Horner was removed from the position he had occupied since the team's very inception. Inside the Red Bull campus, the atmosphere was surreal. Staff who had worked under Horner for years were left speechless. Some felt relief, others confusion, and many more an overwhelming sense of unease. While Horner had been a divisive figure in recent years, he had also been the team's most enduring constant, the compass by which thousands navigated their daily roles. With him gone, the very cultural framework of Red Bull racing stood in flux. Roles were thrown into disarray. Authority became ambiguous. Morale dipped. The factory floor no longer echoed with urgency, it buzzed with paranoia. Outside the garage, the fallout was immediate. Sponsors demanded clarity. Rival teams scrambled to understand the implications. Journalists descended with a hunger for truth, but few received more than carefully curated deflections. Max Verstappen, ever poised in public, made brief remarks emphasizing the team's unity, but behind closed doors, insiders claimed he had become emboldened, asserting more control over team operations, including direct input into strategic hires and internal restructuring. The FIA reportedly monitored the situation with growing concern. Unverified leaks suggested that Horner's dismissal might have legal ramifications, that behind the diplomatic phrasing of the announcement lay a potential web of non-disclosure agreements, internal investigations, and deeply personal confrontations that had been buried to avoid scandal. Some even whispered about explosive meetings involving Horner and Red Bull's Austrian ownership, where raised voices and slammed doors were all that separated continuity from collapse. And what of Horner himself? He vanished. No press conference. No televised farewell. No Instagram post. A man whose voice had once dominated the airwaves was now nowhere to be found. His silence became louder than words, sparking speculation, igniting conspiracies, and setting the internet ablaze with theories. Was he planning a comeback with another team? Would he write a tell-all memoir? Could he reappear at the helm of a rival organization, armed with knowledge only he possessed? No one knew. But the mere idea of Horner operating outside of Red Bull sent chills through the sports political establishment. Because for all the conflict, for all the bitterness that marked his final months, one thing remains undisputed: Christian Horner changed Formula One. He redefined how a modern team operates, how success is manufactured, and how narrative can be wielded as power. He outlasted rivals, survived rule changes, negotiated billion-dollar partnerships, and brought titles back to back to back. His departure is not merely a personnel change, it is a destabilizing event that could alter Red Bull's dominance and reshape the power structure of the entire sport. Now, the paddock holds its breath. Red Bull moves forward, at least outwardly, with a brave face, insisting on continuity and focus. But the undercurrents of chaos are impossible to ignore. Leadership struggles rarely end cleanly, and the vacuum Horner leaves behind is too vast to seal overnight. The team may continue winning. They may still set lap records, claim pole positions, and lift trophies. But deep inside the foundations, something unspoken has shifted. A giant has fallen. A regime has ended. And what rises from its ashes is not yet clear. Even before anything had been made official, before statements were drafted, before press releases were circulated, before the media had any confirmed detail, there were signs, quiet but undeniable, that the walls around Christian Horner's authority at Red Bull Racing were starting to thin. The signs didn't arrive all at once, and they didn't make a scene. But for those paying attention to the subtleties of Formula One's internal politics, the tension was obvious. The situation had moved beyond whispers and onto a slow-burning disintegration of stability, and it began not with scandal or scandalous headlines, but with the calculated exits of individuals who had long defined the team's core identity. The first to go was Adrian Newey. His departure, though kept deliberately understated, sent an unmistakable message through the paddock. Newey wasn't just another engineer, he was the genius behind nearly every aerodynamically superior car the team had produced. His understanding of airflow, downforce, and packaging strategy bordered on art. So when he decided it was time to step away, people didn't just ask why, people asked what he saw coming. That kind of genius doesn't walk away casually. It walks away when it sees something broken, or worse, something unfixable. Newey's exit alone would have triggered alarm, but the sequence that followed erased any doubt that this was a routine reshuffle. Rob Marshall, whose mechanical ingenuity and vehicle design intuition had elevated Red Bull's machinery to unmatched levels, chose to step down. Then came Jonathan Wheatley, a master of operations and pit wall execution, a man whose voice had guided the team through countless strategic storms. When Will Courtney followed, the message was clear: this was not evolution, this was collapse by attrition. Each individual departure was like the removal of a keystone from a complex, delicate structure. And as those structural pieces disappeared, Horner remained, seemingly unaffected, projecting the same poised demeanor in front of cameras and journalists. He spoke about continuity, long-term planning, and internal transitions. But within the inner circles of F1, nobody was fooled. These weren't people seeking new challenges. They were escaping something they no longer believed in. They were separating themselves from a leadership model that no longer inspired confidence. And behind closed doors, people had begun to name that model. Christian Horner. At the heart of the storm, strangely quiet, was Max Verstappen. Known for his emotional candor, sharp opinions, and fearless confrontation, Verstappen had changed. He was no longer the public warrior defending the team at every turn. His posture became closed. His responses became cold. His trust, once absolute, had evaporated. He wasn't saying much, but what he wasn't saying was far louder. Questions about his commitment to the team were met with vague deflections. Inquiries into his contract future were dodged with scripted vagueness. And when Verstappen becomes ambiguous, it's never unintentional. It's a signal. And everyone around him knew what it meant. Then came the real panic, the whispers, not from tabloids, but from high-ranking sources, indicating that Mercedes had entered the picture. And not just idly. It was said that Toto Wolff himself had begun probing Verstappen's camp with direct conversations. Even more disturbing was the information that Ola Kalinius, the man at the very top of Mercedes-Benz global operations, had personally approved the pursuit. That meant this wasn't just a driver negotiation. This was a full-scale mission. A mission to extract the most dominant force in motorsport from Red Bull and rebuild Mercedes' own legacy around him. Inside Red Bull, the reaction was immediate. Fear spread, not publicly, but within corridors and encrypted phone calls. Verstappen's departure wasn't an option. It wasn't even thinkable. He wasn't just a fast driver, he was the linchpin of the entire structure. The reason sponsors wrote 8-figure checks. The reason engineers worked until sunrise. The reason junior drivers wore Red Bull overalls with pride. To lose Max was to watch the entire identity of the team disintegrate in real time. And then came the ultimatum. Delivered not through press briefings, but behind locked doors, through secure meetings with select board members and power brokers, Verstappen's message was direct, ruthless, and non-negotiable. There would be no coexistence. It was either Horner, or him. That kind of demand doesn't just expose internal rifts, it detonates them. Within hours, Red Bull's top brass moved. No more hesitation. No more public defense. No more shielding Horner from the consequences of mounting tension. The man who had led them through every chapter of their golden era was suddenly deemed expendable. Not because he had lost his talent. Not because he had failed technically. But because the cost of keeping him had become too high. The future of Red Bull was no longer tethered to Horner, it was chained to Verstappen. And keeping Verstappen meant cutting Horner loose. It was an unceremonious fall for a man whose fingerprints were all over Red Bull's rise from irrelevance to dynasty. A man who had negotiated every major sponsorship, orchestrated every critical driver signing, and micromanaged the most dominant era since Ferrari's Schumacher days. And yet, when the pressure point was reached, there was no celebration of his legacy. There was only urgency to replace him. But that's not where this story ends. Because while many expected Horner to retreat, to disappear from the F1 landscape with his reputation bruised and his influence diminished, what followed defied every prediction. He didn't vanish. He didn't even slow down. Almost immediately, offers began flooding in. Not from mid-pack teams hoping for a boost, but from serious entities. From manufacturers plotting entry into the sport. From investors seeking to acquire existing teams. From key figures within Formula One's elite infrastructure who saw Horner's removal not as failure, but as liberation. They saw a strategist unchained. A tactician ready to rebuild. Horner, despite the fall, still held the rarest form of capital in Formula One, credibility. He was still the man who had built a winning culture, managed superstar personalities, won constructors' titles, navigated regulatory chaos, and outplayed rivals on the political battlefield time and again. No scandal could erase that. No boardroom decision could erase 2 decades of elite results. And now, unburdened by the daily grind of maintaining control at Red Bull, he could do what he had always done best, create. It's not difficult to imagine what comes next. A new role. A new base. a startup project, or even something far more revolutionary, an alliance with figures who've long admired his work, ready to throw their resources behind a fresh venture. Whatever form it takes, it will be sharp, fast-moving, and relentless. Because Horner is not a man who fades into retirement. He's a builder, a mover, a survivor. And if Red Bull thought they were closing a chapter, they may have accidentally opened a far more dangerous one. One in which Christian Horner no longer has to protect the kingdom he built. One in which he gets to write the rules all over again. And this time, with nothing to lose. Just minutes after the news of Christian Horner's forced departure from Red Bull began circulating across the paddock, a storm of speculation erupted, one that quickly evolved into something more tangible, more deliberate, and far more explosive. Behind the scenes, influential figures within Ferrari, Formula One's most revered and emotionally volatile team, had already resumed discreet but purposeful discussions with Horner, reigniting a dialogue that had first been initiated many months prior. At the time, those conversations had been short-lived, dismissed by Horner himself with a mixture of British charm and Red Bull loyalty. He had publicly brushed off the idea of joining Ferrari, joking that he didn't speak the language and had no intention of leaving the empire he had painstakingly helped build over the course of nearly 2 decades. But those words belonged to a different moment, to a version of Horner who still believed he had full control over his destiny at Red Bull. That version no longer exists. What was once a passing rumor has now become a swirling maelstrom of possibility. Horner, now unencumbered by the constraints of his previous role, finds himself at an unprecedented crossroads, free from obligations, driven by an unquenched competitive fire, and seduced by the idea of leading the one team that transcends motorsport and becomes legend. Ferrari, a name drenched in glory, passion, and pressure, has always been more than a racing outfit. It's a global institution, an emotional symbol, a myth made real. And for Horner, who thrives on challenge, unpredictability, and the intricate dance of power, the opportunity to take charge of this volatile giant might be the most irresistible prospect of his entire career. Meanwhile, within Maranello's hallowed walls, the atmosphere has grown increasingly unstable. Despite Ferrari's vast financial resources, cutting-edge facilities, and roster of talent, the team continues to spiral in and out of confusion, showing flashes of potential followed by stretches of underperformance that defy logic. Frédéric Vasseur, brought in to restore order and inject clarity into Ferrari's fragmented hierarchy, has struggled to leave a lasting imprint. While his intentions were noble and his credentials respectable, his leadership has thus far lacked the assertiveness, charisma, and vision necessary to unify such a historically divided and politically charged operation. Strategic missteps, hesitation in high-pressure moments, and an overall sense of organizational hesitation have become disturbingly routine. From the outside, the occasional podium finish or strong qualifying result may suggest progress, but those who understand the sport at a deeper level know that Ferrari is, at its core, drifting. The team appears directionless, unable to establish a coherent long-term strategy, with internal allegiances muddying technical decisions and undermining driver morale. Nowhere is this dysfunction more evident than in the dynamic between its 2 star drivers, Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. What should have been a triumphant pairing of youthful brilliance and championship-winning experience has instead deteriorated into a quiet power struggle, with the British icon steadily finding himself on the margins. Hamilton, who joined Ferrari in a move that sent shockwaves through the F1 world, did so with the belief that he could help elevate the team back to its former glory while carving out one final legacy chapter of his own. But instead of being embraced as a cornerstone, he has increasingly been treated as a temporary asset, useful for his brand, his insights, and his draw, but not necessarily prioritized in the team's developmental roadmap. Multiple internal accounts suggest that Hamilton's garage has received upgrades later than Leclerc's, that his requests for setup modifications have been shelved or delayed, and that his voice in key technical briefings has been noticeably diminished. The illusion of equality has given way to a reality of imbalance. Leclerc, though undeniably talented and deeply embedded within the Ferrari structure, has quietly benefited from stronger political capital. He knows the internal language, he's built long-standing alliances, and he understands how to navigate the subtle corridors of influence that define Ferrari's inner sanctum. While Hamilton has relied on merit, legacy, and his formidable racing IQ, Leclerc has played a longer game, one that includes softly influencing engineers, nudging strategic decisions, and ensuring that his preferences shape the direction of car development. This isn't malicious, it's simply how Ferrari has operated for years, a team often split not by engineering philosophies but by the interpersonal dynamics of the men behind the wheel. Into this increasingly volatile environment steps the possibility of Horner, a man who has built his reputation on turning dysfunction into dominance. His tenure at Red Bull was not defined solely by titles or trophies, but by his ability to manage complex personalities, resolve internal rivalries, and foster a relentless culture of performance. He didn't just survive the pressure, he made it his playground. Managing drivers like Sebastian Vettel and Max Verstappen required more than tactical knowledge. It required emotional intelligence, strategic foresight, and the ability to balance egos without letting either sink the ship. Horner doesn't flinch under pressure. He absorbs it and uses it to sharpen every decision, every maneuver, every move. Now imagine that mentality injected into Ferrari, a team that has long struggled to balance internal harmony with external performance. The thought of Horner walking through the gates of Maranello and assuming control is not merely a tantalizing fantasy, it's a potential revolution. The executive board, including John Elkann and Benedetto Vigna, had until recently been aligned behind Vasseur, content to let the current regime carry on through the 2026 regulation changes. But all indications now suggest that those assurances are dissolving. Horner's sudden availability has reconfigured the entire calculus. The Ferrari board is no longer thinking in terms of stability, they're thinking about transformation. Whispers from within suggest that meetings have already taken place. Discreet, off-site, cloaked in deniability, but real. The conversations are no longer about whether Horner fits Ferrari, they're about how quickly he could take over, and who he would bring with him. The implications are staggering. His appointment would likely signal the departure of several current senior figures, the restructuring of entire technical divisions, and a recalibration of power within the driver lineup. It could also trigger a chain reaction across the grid, as engineers, performance directors, and even sponsors begin positioning themselves around what could be a seismic shift in the sport's balance of power. Horner wouldn't come alone. He would bring with him a constellation of talent, people he's trusted, people who understand the language of champions, people who have built winning cars and winning cultures. His arrival would send a thunderous message across the paddock. Ferrari is no longer content with symbolism, it is now pursuing substance. Not nostalgia, but results. Not branding, but championships. And in that pursuit, Lewis Hamilton would find new life. With a leader who understands how to unlock his full potential, who listens, who acts decisively, and who builds systems around performance rather than politics, Hamilton's fading Ferrari chapter could be rewritten into something unforgettable. Leclerc, too, would be forced to evolve. No longer insulated by internal familiarity, he would have to compete on equal terms, judged not by proximity to the center of influence but by lap times, feedback accuracy, and race day execution. Horner would offer no favoritism, no safe zones, only meritocracy. And in that crucible, both drivers could be pushed to levels neither has reached in years. What happens next is uncertain, but the stage has been set. The paddock can feel it. The energy has shifted. What once seemed impossible now feels inevitable. And if Christian Horner does walk into that Ferrari garage, the sport may never be the same again. Christian Horner's impact on the modern era of Formula One can't be measured merely by championships or podiums. It must be understood in terms of transformation, resilience, and strategic genius. His influence runs far deeper than a collection of trophies. His fingerprints are embedded in the DNA of Red Bull Racing, a team he built from the ground up, nurtured through its infancy, and elevated into a global powerhouse. His early success alongside Sebastian Vettel was not just a stroke of luck with a fast car. It was a perfectly engineered symphony of timing, vision, and an obsession with operational excellence. While others marveled at Vettel's speed, insiders understood the architect behind it all was Horner, a man who could manipulate the chaos of an F1 weekend into something surgical and repeatable. But it wasn't just the glory years that made Horner legendary. His true brilliance emerged in adversity. When Red Bull's relationship with Renault deteriorated into one of the most public and acrimonious splits in the sport's history, many thought the team would regress. The power unit issues, the breakdown in trust, the barrage of negative press, it would have crippled a less stable operation. But Horner doesn't fold. He recalibrates. He orchestrated an alliance with Honda that was widely doubted at the time. Many considered it a desperate reach. But what looked like a gamble proved to be a masterstroke. Within a few seasons, Red Bull was back at the front, leaner, faster, and tactically sharper than ever before. And then came the Max Verstappen era, where Horner's ability to mold a team around a generational talent took center stage once again. It wasn't just about speed, it was about consistency, mental toughness, and tactical depth. In 2023, despite having a car that wasn't universally regarded as the quickest over a season, Horner pulled off one of the most tactically flawless campaigns in recent memory. Race after race, Red Bull outmaneuvered its rivals, not always with sheer horsepower, but with tire strategy, pit stop precision, weather anticipation, and split-second calls that made the difference between victory and defeat. It wasn't just a win, it was a message. Horner had done it again. He had constructed a machine capable of beating not just the clock, but the odds. Now, picture that same mind, that same vision, stepping into the corridors of Maranello. Ferrari, the sport's oldest and most romantic name, has been caught in a cycle of near successes and costly missteps. Despite having a car that on paper should contend for wins, they've repeatedly fallen short, undone by erratic calls, inconsistent leadership, and a fractured internal culture. What Horner brings to the table is not just technical refinement or strategic sharpness, it's control, unity, and direction. He knows how to turn disjointed parts into a winning ecosystem, where every department operates with a single purpose and where accountability is not feared but embraced. The Ferrari garage has long been plagued by confusion and political noise. Horner would silence that chaos with structure, hierarchy, and an obsession with detail. But beyond the nuts and bolts of racing lies the emotional pull, what this move would mean for Horner personally. After dedicating decades of his life to one team, only to be edged aside as Red Bull's political wind shifted, this wouldn't just be a career change, it would be a personal reckoning. Being sidelined from the empire he built would leave any man searching for purpose. And for Horner, the challenge of resurrecting Ferrari, the sleeping giant of Formula One, offers exactly that. It's not just about competing again. It's about rewriting the final act of his story, not as someone who faded away, but as someone who came back with more fire, more wisdom, and a new mission. This isn't just speculation, it's already in motion. Rumors swirl of behind-the-scenes contact between Horner and Lewis Hamilton shortly after the British driver's blockbuster switched to Ferrari. The former adversaries, once symbolic of opposite philosophies in the Red Bull-Mercedes battleground, now find themselves converging, driven by similar motives. The war they fought, full of venom, mind games, and moments that split fanbases, left its scars. But what if those same battle-hardened instincts could now be turned inward, focused not on destroying each other, but on building something historic together? For Hamilton, the potential arrival of Horner is far more than a tactical improvement, it's a spiritual reset. The later years at Mercedes became bogged down in political infighting, inconsistent car development, and a feeling of being undermined within his own fortress. Ferrari, glamorous as it may be, is no stranger to internal dysfunction either. But Horner represents a clean slate, a leader who's not only obsessed with winning but capable of cutting through the noise to make it happen. Hamilton knows what it's like to drive fast. What he's looking for now is a machine that can support his hunger to dominate one last time. Horner could give him that. He could give him clarity. He could give him peace. Insiders say Horner's call to Hamilton was not a formality, it was a gesture of solidarity. An assurance that the drama and betrayal that have stained both of their recent histories would not be repeated under his watch. Horner isn't just promising structure, he's promising protection. For a driver like Hamilton, who thrives when fully empowered, that kind of backing is priceless. It could be the key that unlocks the ruthless version of Lewis the world saw at his peak. The message was simple but profound. This time, the team would be built around performance, not politics. And therein lies the magic of this possible partnership. These are two men who have seen the best and worst of the sport. They've triumphed at the highest level and been betrayed in boardrooms and back channels. They know how quickly admiration turns into rivalry, and how easily success breeds instability. But they also know what it takes to win when everything is on the line. They speak the same language, one of sacrifice, precision, and legacy. Their connection isn't born out of convenience. It's born out of war. The anticipation around this union is electric because it offers something Formula One rarely does anymore, a sense of destiny. It's the idea that two icons who were never supposed to work together might be the only ones capable of restoring Ferrari to its rightful place. Every detail matters. Every glance, every meeting, every design tweak and tactical decision would be loaded with intent. Fans wouldn't just be watching races. They'd be watching history being molded in real time. Every point scored would represent something more than statistics. It would be vindication. The paddock is already holding its breath. Teams are watching, drivers are calculating, sponsors are strategizing. If Horner and Hamilton truly align under Ferrari's banner, the sport won't just experience a shift in competition, it will undergo a shift in mythology. These two figures have loomed large over the last decade for different reasons. If they join forces, they could dominate the next one not just with machinery, but with narrative power that transcends the racetrack. This is not just a pairing of talent and strategy, it's a convergence of two unfinished stories. And if they manage to pull this off, if they conquer Ferrari's inner turmoil and turn it into glory, the echoes of that achievement will resonate through Formula One forever. The dialogue that unfolded between Christian Horner and Lewis Hamilton wasn't just an exchange of words. It was the culmination of years of tension, suspicion, and unspoken truths finally finding the air they deserved. It was intense. It was direct. It was the kind of conversation that left both men altered, one emboldened, the other exposed to a painful clarity he had long sensed but never had confirmed in such brutal detail. This was not a polite corporate interaction hidden behind euphemisms or wrapped in polished public relations rhetoric. This was raw. Horner, with the gravitas of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to rebuild, laid out the full, uncomfortable reality with unwavering precision. He confirmed to Hamilton, without evasion or sugarcoating, that what the seven-time champion had feared all along was not paranoia, it was fact. Hamilton had, over the course of several seasons, begun to detect a pattern he couldn't quite prove but couldn't ignore either. He'd see updates arrive at the team's garage, new parts that promised to shave tenths off lap times, yet somehow those developments seemed to appear on Charles Leclerc's car first. The explanations were always dressed in complexity, logistics, simulations, availability, but over time, they began to feel hollow. He noticed decisions that lacked consistency, strategy calls that defied logic, subtle shifts in behavior during debriefs, slight changes in tone during engineering meetings. Every incident on its own was deniable, but together, they painted a portrait that couldn't be unseen. Still, he carried on, because speaking up in Formula One without evidence is often more damaging than silence. But now, standing in front of Horner, the fog of ambiguity was gone. The former Red Bull boss confirmed it all. Hamilton had indeed been sidelined, not overtly, not in headlines, but through a quiet internal favoritism that favored his younger teammate. Horner detailed how upgrades were rerouted, how performance insights from Hamilton's telemetry were sometimes redirected, how development paths were nudged to benefit Leclerc without transparency. Hamilton's reaction was more complex than outrage. There was no shouting, no theatrical display of anger, just the kind of stunned silence that comes from having your worst fears validated by someone with the credentials to know. He wasn't surprised, but he was deeply moved. The truth didn't just hurt. It also healed. For years, he had been second-guessing himself. Now, finally, someone had the courage to say it out loud. And then came Horner's vow, not a vague promise, but a detailed, actionable commitment to overhaul Ferrari's culture from the inside out. He spoke of stripping away the informal networks that had wielded influence behind the scenes. He described his vision of a structure where every engineer, strategist, and driver would operate under the same expectations, governed by metrics, not relationships. Data would drive decision-making. Merit would define success. If given the full authority to reshape the organization, Horner intended to bring in external specialists to audit the team's inner workings, install new feedback systems to ensure transparency in car development, and above all, eliminate any trace of manipulation, favoritism, or loyalty based on anything other than pure measurable performance. No more privilege based on image. No more political games that served only the loudest voices or the most marketable faces. Under his leadership, Ferrari would evolve into a performance-driven entity where equality wasn't just a buzzword, it was enforced with ruthless precision. Hamilton, long accustomed to having to fight battles both on and off the circuit, didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. He had been waiting for someone like this, someone who didn't just recognize injustice, but had the power, the plan, and the will to crush it. And as this revolution was quietly being sketched in a secluded office in Maranello, chaos began to ripple through Horner's former empire. Red Bull Racing, for so long a bastion of strategic precision and internal harmony, suddenly looked vulnerable. With Laurent Mekies stepping into the massive vacuum Horner had left behind, questions began to circulate faster than any paddock rumor mill could contain. Mekies, while respected in his own right, lacked Horner's unique ability to balance politics, personnel, and pressure under one roof. Red Bull wasn't just losing a team principle, it was losing its nucleus. And with that loss came a chain reaction that could redefine the sport. Max Verstappen, the team's most potent weapon and its most volatile asset, had never operated in an unstable environment. His loyalty, always assumed to be unshakable, began to show fractures. Whispers grew louder. Would he stay in a system no longer molded around his aggressive driving style, his blunt communication, his demand for perfection? Horner had been his anchor. Without him, Verstappen was adrift in a team no longer tailored to maximize his unique brilliance. The implications of a potential Verstappen exit were staggering. Without their lead driver and their architect, Red Bull would be forced to look to its next generation. Talents like Isaac Hadjar or Ayumu Iwasa might be promising, but they are unproven at the highest level. They would be inheriting a team no longer structured, unified, or hardened by the iron discipline Horner had instilled. What was once a relentless, data-driven, strategically brilliant operation had become a group of talented individuals without a shared rhythm. The aura of invincibility that had defined Red Bull for years began to fade into uncertainty. Meanwhile, Horner, now free from the responsibilities that had confined his creativity, isn't resting. He's plotting. He's watching every race, every session, every press conference, and he's preparing something bigger than anyone expects. He is no longer confined by a system he had already perfected. He is now operating with total freedom, backed by experience, knowledge, and a personal mission to build something better. His ambition is no longer about defending a legacy, it's about crafting a new one, from the wreckage of chaos and the ashes of compromise. And at the center of this movement is Hamilton, a warrior rediscovered. No longer forced to smile through disappointment or suppress his instincts for the sake of diplomacy. He has been reborn, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, professionally. Together, Horner and Hamilton are not merely a partnership of convenience. They are a storm built from shared scars, united not by history, but by a vision of what Formula One can become when you remove ego, silence politics, and let excellence lead. The sport, as it always does, continues to spin on. Cars line up on Sunday. Engines roar. Flags wave. But beneath the noise, something fundamental is shifting. The pillars of the old order are beginning to crack. The forces that once seemed immovable are now under pressure. And standing at the forefront of this tectonic change is a man once cast aside, and a driver once underestimated. They are not trying to return to what was. They are charging toward what's possible. Christian Horner isn't gone. He's just getting started. And the world of Formula may first soon realize that letting him go was the most consequential mistake any team could have made.